We have two very talented colleagues. Our first presenter today will be Ms. Emily Williams. After her, we will have Mr. Jeremiah Ariaz. He received his BFA from Kansas City Art Institute and MFA from the State University of New York at Buffalo. His photographs examine the constructs of American identity within personal, community, and political contexts. Ariaz is a recipient of numerous awards and grants, including an Atlas Grant, the Michael P. Smith Award for Documentary Photography from the Louisiana Endowment for Humanities, the 2018 South Arts Finalist Prize, and he was named the 2018 Louisiana State Fellow. A monograph of his photographs, Louisiana Trail Riders, is available from UO Press. The book has been featured in the Paris Review, U.S. News and World Report, Oxford American, among other publications.
So Emily is a student of mine at LSU. I'm her faculty advisor, and I'm really proud of the breadth of her research, and I'm grateful that she's asked me to be a part of this and share some of the work that I've been making recently to be in conversation with her. So I'm going to talk about photographs that I've been making in newspaper offices in my home state of Kansas. So over the last 15 years, a quarter of the nation's newspapers have closed. That's an average of 2 newspapers a week across our country. So this is a project that I've been pursuing with a real sense of urgency, especially since about the run-up to the last 2020 presidential election. And the newspaper offices were just one subject among many that I was photographing across the country, primarily in the battleground states, feeling that this is just a historic moment in our nation's history. And I was searching for visible signs of a fracturing democracy. And subjects included election campaign offices. There were sites of civil unrest. There was the militarized southern border and other subjects. But as I was working on this, the newspaper offices really stood out to me. They felt special. And I wanted to separate those so they would become their own body of work. And then these pictures would kind of stand alone to become their own series, a project I've titled The Hard-Traveling Battleground Blues, because it's the battleground states of the country. And I'm going to be showing this work in October at the Baton Rouge Gallery. So that's just going to be right before voters take to the polls. I wanted to be in conversation with our political movement. But sort of distilled from that project were these newspaper offices, and which I found a subject that enabled me to speak about my concerns of both our democracy and our community. And I was especially interested in rural America. I'm from a very small town in Kansas, and rural America is just not represented in many avenues. And I wanted to bring some attention there. And so Kansas also serves a good place for me because it's the geographic center of the country. It's the middle of things. And I felt if I could make this work as completely as possible there, that it might stand in as a kind of window to the nation. And so during a sabbatical in 2022 that I had from LSU, I traveled back to my home state and I photographed these newspaper offices all across the state, ultimately 125 offices in total, many more than I anticipated ever being there. And so I sort of feel that these unassuming businesses are beacons of our democracy in a divided America. In the past 15 years, the number of working journalists has fallen by half. So how do we even begin to make sense of that? It just feels so big and it feels so abstract. How do we absorb the implications of that loss? I hope that the photographs become a way to understand the weight of that disappearance and to contemplate the consequence. I wanted to show what that loss looks like, to make it tangible, but also to serve as a kind of rallying cry. So inside these newspaper offices, I found this rich record of these individual communities and a platform for the national concerns. There's layers of history visible in every corner, from the meticulous archives to these inky fingerprints from the printing presses. The photographs offer this real sensual description of print media production. An aluminum printing plate with silhouetted soldiers in salute, a photography darkroom, a little piece of my own professional history, the mechanics of a printing press humming along as it prints the daily edition of the paper. These images celebrate the civic function, the labor, and technology, both past and present, of local community newspapers' production, while documenting their collective peril. Together, I hope these images create a collective portrait of Kansas. So I photographed these kind of portraits of each office. And these editors that I met while working on this project inspired me. Many of them were running one-person operations. Several did not collect a paycheck, just continuing out of a sense of a duty to serve their community. Some were young and just getting started in the business, and others were carrying forth a family tradition of newspaper ownership that dated back to the mid-1800s, to the founding of the state and the founding of those publications. Ink was in their blood. And many of these people, I fear, will not find a replacement to shepherd their institutions to the next generation. In the brief time since I've been making the work, several offices have shut down or been reduced to a shadow of their former selves. Even the most herald, the Kansas Emporium Gazette. So the Gazette was famous because of one particular figure that was the editor there, late 1800s, early 1900s, by the name of William Allen White. He continues to be a very celebrated journalist, and at the time he was a very prominent national figure. His writing was syndicated nationally in other newspapers across the country. And when I arrived to the Gazette office, it's this stately two-story building. The name is chiseled in stone across the facade, but as I approached, I found that the doors were locked. Built in 1900, this building had been the home of the Gazette for 122 years. Just weeks before my arrival, it had closed. So I was lucky to have gained access to the building a few days later, and I just wandered this cavernous space. In White's former wood-paneled office, the sculpted head of a stag lay on the floor. There were these just artifacts. There was a calendar for July 2022, just weeks before I was standing there, which remained eerily taped to the chalkboard in one of the old newsrooms. On the floor of a closet were stacks of linen-bound archives of the paper, the brittle pages accumulating in pieces on the floor. On a long line of empty shelves, I found a single deserted volume titled The First Amendment Freedoms. Abandoned. In the main newsroom, all that remained was this map of the world, which reminded me that these newspapers, these small town newspapers, were once a community's connection to the outside world. And a staffer later shared this black and white photograph with me that shows a room full of activity. And it was made by a former Gazette photographer by the name of Michael Dakota. And he said to me that it was just a few years after this photo was taken that layoffs and downsizing started. We still had copy editors and reporters that had beats. I think we all knew the end was coming, but none of us imagined how quickly everything would change. This experience of arriving at a newspaper office to find an empty building was repeated again and again and again. There was the Newton Kansan, the Wellington Daily News, the El Dorado Times, and many others. Most of these would have closed in the year that I was making these photographs. And in nearly every one of these vacant offices, the sign still hung from the building. In some cases, the newspapers had moved to a much smaller location, and in other cases, they had ceased publication altogether. This gave me a real sense of urgency as I was making the photographs. A storyteller's job is to make the invisible visible. And in this photograph from just a few weeks ago, over the winter break, I got access to another newspaper office that had been closed for several months. And I'm in there, and there's this reporter's desk covered with notebooks, and on top is the January 6th report. No one had worked in the office for months, and debris from the ceiling can be seen on the office chair. So what happens when citizens no longer have a trusted source for news? Polls following the recent Iowa caucus found that 2/3 of voters falsely believed that Biden was not the legitimate winner of the 2020 election. In 2019, a PEN America study concluded, as journalism declines, government officials conduct themselves with less integrity, efficiency, and effectiveness, and corporate malfeasance goes unchecked. With the loss of local news, citizens are less likely to vote, less politically informed, and less likely to run for office. In other words, democracy loses its foundation. Since 2005, about 2,200 local newspapers across America have closed. To see these spaces vacated and to find these voices silenced, the presses still, is a way to visualize what is being lost. The decline of local news works in devastatingly perfect concert with the right-wing disinformation machine. While there's been a loss of local news, there's an increasing spread of disinformation, especially online. There are cries of fake news, and elected officials declare journalists enemies of the people. Amongst this noise, our newspapers are quietly closing. This is another photograph from just a couple weeks back. It's an encyclopedia that was open beside a desk. And I just couldn't believe it when I looked down to find the page that was open. It said citizenship. I feel like this is what we are losing. But I also find hope in many of the offices. Susan, seen here against the wall, is the editor and publisher of the Iowa Register. Her family has owned and operated the newspaper since its origin in 1867. On the back of the wall hangs a portrait of her, her father, her grandfather, and her great-grandfather, each portrait made at the time of their ownership. Her son, Tim, had recently moved back to Iowa from New York City, where he was a teacher, and he is now the managing editor of the paper, and presumably one day his portrait is going to hang with the rest of his family. But this is the kind of thing that we're losing. These editors who are leaders in their community, newspapers that reflect the needs and the concerns of a town, and offices that hold the community's collective history. As a young editor, William Allen White from the Gazette imagined 1,000 emporias lighting the landscape in the West. And these lights are fading. Kansas lies at the precipice of the nation's news desert, at its most arid across the western half of the country. This is a map that was published pretty recently in the Washington Post, highlighting the loss of these local newspapers. But this loss is far greater than ink and paper. It's the fabric which ties a community together and underlies our American democratic experiment. So what happens to a democracy without a free press? On Friday, August 11th, 2023, law enforcement raided the office of the Marion County Record, as well as the homes of its editor, owners, and reporters. Commenting on the raid in the Kansas Reflector, the editor, Eric Meyer, said, "I didn't think this could happen in America." Surveillance footage there of them going through their materials and calling off their computers, making it so they would be unable to print their next paper. The news quickly became an international news story, and on August 17th, the Washington Post published an opinion piece I authored that included 12 photographs from multiple visits to the record. Tim Staffer of the LA Register tells me, "The decimation of America's newspapers over the last 2 decades has been well documented. That story has been told, and it's a tragedy. But here we are, still standing, still publishing 5 days a week, still telling our community's story. A newspaper in 2022 informs its readers, sure. But its real purpose is to tie each reader to another, to give its community a spirit, a shared reality, a sense of purpose and possibility. These images are both an ode and an elegy. I hope for them to be an inspiration as well as a warning and a love letter to my home state of Kansas." So one of the outcomes of these photographs is I started working with a graphic designer in Kansas to produce a publication that has the look and feel of a newspaper. And in scale, in design, it's called the Kansas Mirror, the fourth estate in the heart of America. And it includes a collection of these photographs paired with 10 letters from the editor, authored by newspaper men and women from across the state. Their rich essays, both personal and political, detail the history of the press in Kansas, stress the importance of local journalism, and describe the precipitous changes to the industry. And they relate firsthand experiences with threats to the freedom of the press. Eric from the Marion County Record authored the final essay. Inside the Record's office, just months prior to the police raid, I photographed this 3-dimensional relief of the Kansas state seal hanging on a faded stucco wall. The state motto reads, "Ad astra per aspera," to the stars through difficulty. So I do have some copies of this available that to share with you if folks are interested. I'm selling them for $20. I can show you those, and I also will just point out one thing. We've got a little bit of time, then I will hope there'll be some questions for the both of us. These photographs were recently exhibited in Hong Kong. When I got this phone call, an email, actually, I was really surprised, but they had seen the work in publication. It was before the Washington Post story, but another publication of national syndication. And they invited me there to exhibit the photographs. And I made a decision to show not just the photographs in the way that I typically would in a photo exhibition, but really to show this paper that I produced. I wanted it to feel like the medium is the message. And in Hong Kong, this is a place where the last pro-democracy newspaper closed in 2021. Police froze its accounts, they raided the offices, and arrested the top editors. The journalists have since been jailed. So this speaks to the fragility of the press, and also our need here in the United States to both support and protect the newspaper industry.